General Joseph E. Johnson is called out of retirement and he's brought back into action with the Army of Tennessee by the request of Robert E. Lee. March 19th, 1865, he would engage in a battle that would be one of the biggest blunders he's probably ever done. Right here at Bentonville Battlefield. Well, today the trip to North Carolina continues on. And I'm out at a location where the last major offensive or battle happened for the Confederate Army, right out here in North Carolina. We're out at the Battle of Bentonville. I'll take you out here and show you some of the places, the grave markers, the different things that are out here. We'll have a conversation about the battle that took place out here. March 19th, 1865, Johnson comes out here to these fields, and he's been told to not get into a major engagement with the Union Army. He sets his headquarters up right there in that field right across the street. He gets his men out here, and Hampton has told him that there's a way for them to hit one of the flanks or one of the wings of the Union Army and surprise attack them and take out a major portion of that army. So the plan is to come over here and hit that wing before it meets up with the second wing, the other portion of Sherman's army. They get out here and success looks like it's going to happen at first when they first start to fight. But then the 19th rolls on by and the army has not been successful at pushing the Union completely off these fields. By the time the 20th comes into play, the rest of the Union army is meeting up at a crossroads right down the street here from where I'm at. And both wings are together. Well, this is a massive army. Johnson has about 20,000 men total when he first comes out here, and they are not all men. It's a ragtag army of junior reserves, children, essentially, teenagers, older men, and some veterans that came in from the Army of Northern Virginia by request. So there's really not a lot to this army that's out here. And he decided to stick around on the 20th and the 21st. Years and years later, he'll defend the reasons why he stuck around, thinking that if he fought a defensive fight, he was waiting on the Union soldiers to come attack him in his trenches. I don't know if that was true or not, but it turned out to be a mistake on his part. Out in these fields here directly in front of me, to the front and to the left, out and over here, Confederate forces counterattacked Union forces under Major General Joseph Mower on three sides. Leading the counterattack to protect the Vital Mill Creek Bridge, the only avenue for retreat of Johnson's army, General William Hardee, along with Confederate cavalry commanders Wheeler, Hampton, and Allen, bought precious time essentially when they counterattacked out here. Expecting another attack, the Confederates extended their lines from Cole Plantation to Mill Creek, and General Johnson continued to brace the Confederate left for another flank attack here. Now, this attack that happened out here was not supposed to happen. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's March 20th, 1865, and the rest of the Union Army here in North Carolina has come into place. And General Sherman decides to make his headquarters right here where I'm located, in Bentonville, North Carolina. The fields that are directly behind me, or right in front of me actually, is where he placed those headquarters. Now, it's a pretty amazing thing to think about when you think about the distance that that army has traveled and the things that they have managed to do since they started their march. The Army of Tennessee is here to fight them. The Army of Tennessee is who he fought in Atlanta, Georgia. That's who he took Atlanta from. The Army of Tennessee turned north towards the forces up there, unsuccessfully fought the forces in Tennessee. And then they made their way out here, what was left of them. General Sherman, however, turns his attention to the south. And as he said, war is hell. He made war on the public, on the civilians, on the private sectors. He marched all the way to Savannah, tearing up railroads and any industry he could that would support the war effort for the South. He burned down plantation homes and dug up and tore up roads along the way. Anything and everything to make life as miserable as possible so that, in his estimation, the people of the South would stop supporting the war effort and would not have the ability to support the war effort. He turns that army north and goes through South Carolina doing the exact same thing. And then eventually, we're getting closer and closer to the end here, he makes his way to the fields directly behind me here. Sets up headquarters for the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina. General Sherman has come to North Carolina. And it's always neat coming out to these fields to see these places, because you read about the battles that take place out here, and a lot of times all you learn about are the men, the officers that were in place, the combat, the amount of casualties, the positioning of those soldiers and things like that. But when you come out to these local places, local sites like this here, you have signs like the one behind me here that talk about the people that lived here. And it gives you a full picture of what goes on in those communities during that time. Now, this particular sign talks about Green and Alcy Ann Denning Flowers' house. And it said it stood just ahead of me there at the crossroads. It said he bought the plot of land out here, and after the war, he became active in politics. Well, by late 1865, he was active in politics, and he was a part of the Republican Party, which was a fairly new party at that time. And it said in 1872, he helped draft a resolution calling for the re-election of President U.S. Grant and Governor T.R. Caldwell, both Republicans. So that's pretty neat. And another neat thing here, in 1867, he served on the local party platform committee, which was comprised of 3 white men and 3 black members. So the man that lived here was involved in politics that at the time would have been considered revolutionary for this location, because of really the treatment of the black men and women that lived out here. And Confederacy, you know, the fight that's happening, if the Confederacy wins, those African American men and women are not going to be allowed to be in politics. They're not going to be allowed to do any of that stuff. They're going to be kept in bondage. The family that's out here, however, maybe they had a different opinion of all of that. I don't really know. I don't know much about that family, but it does seem to me that that might be the case, considering he was in the Republican Party at that time, and he helped draft that resolution. It's just some real neat history here in Bentonville. And you have to come out to these battlefields to see these signs and read the history for yourself to fully understand it and to get a grasp on it. It's just real neat to check this stuff out. Now, directly behind me here is Flowers Crossroads at the Battle of Bentonville. And on the 20th of March, 1865, out at this location, there were about 2,000 Confederate soldiers out here defending these crossroads. But they were about to get hit head on with 26,000 soldiers from Sherman's Union Army. There was a small contingent of cavalry that was sent out here to try to help this situation out. But there was no need in it, honestly. As these Confederates were sitting out here on this road and they started seeing O.O. Howard's men coming from behind me there, right up this turnpike. It was pretty clear that the fight was going to be over here real soon. They ended up sending Joseph Wheeler out here, however, and the weight was off of the shoulders of the cavalryman that was out here in charge. Evander Law was positioned out here, and he was asking for reinforcements at this crossroads to try to keep it. They slowed it down as much as they could, but there's not much that you can do when you're facing 26,000 soldiers and you yourself only have a force of 3,000 to 2,000 soldiers. O.O. Howard came up here and did what he was supposed to do, and the United States Army succeeded in taking these crossroads and moving the Confederates out of this position. Now, directly ahead of me there, about a quarter mile to the front of where I'm standing right now, stood the center of the Confederate line on the 20th of March. And it was shaped kind of like a horseshoe. The center was faced southwards towards the Goldsboro Road. And Johnston's decision to remain on the battlefield after his failure on the previous day was pretty surprising. The arrival of Sherman's right wing, combined with Johnston's reputation for caution, suggested that the Confederates would hastily retreat, essentially. Johnston's explanation for risking his army changed over the years. He initially claimed that he hoped Sherman would attack him in his well-fortified positions, hinting that Confederate morale would be jeopardized by a retreat. A decade later, he explained that there was no object in remaining but covering the bearing off of our wounded. His memory may have been affected by his near disaster on March 21st. Johnston was alerted on March 20th that most of the right wing would approach from the east, placing them behind the Confederates. Joe directed his cavalry to delay Sherman's approach and ordered R.F. Hoke's division and North Carolina Junior Reserves to face east and south, respectively. Johnston's right remained in its original position to deter advance by the Union left wing. And as I place this map up on the screen for you to take a look at, you can kind of see the position. It looks like a horseshoe there, and we're facing a direction towards the North Carolina Junior Reserves, who are facing over here. Now, directly in the fields behind me here was the line of what they call the North Carolina Junior Reserves out here in Bentonville. This is kind of one of the more sad stories of this war. The Junior Reserves are basically men that are pressed into the armed conflict, and they're not really men. The vast majority of them are really young individuals from the state of North Carolina. I myself had an ancestor that was a part of something like that. And I also had many ancestors that fought for the Northern Army as well, that were not drafted into the Northern Army. They volunteered to go. But a lot of these young men out here had the tenacity and the fighting spirit of any other unit. And a lot of them, like I said, they were basically drafted into the service by the Confederate Army to fight out here as a last-ditch effort to plus up the numbers of bodies to put in place. And essentially that's what they were. They weren't very well trained. They didn't have the experience of young men with the muskets and the rifles that they had at that time. They were young men out here in these fields fighting grown men. There's not much else to say about that. It's a sad situation for sure. No matter what side they're fighting for, when you have a bunch of children in the field fighting, it's very sad. Some of the names that will be mentioned out here is Braxton Bragg and Joseph E. Johnston. And that's primarily because the majority of the troops that were fighting out here came from the Army of Tennessee. And if you consider where they came from, the long story of the defeats and everything else that happened in Tennessee, it's pretty amazing the distance that army traveled just to be able to get out here in North Carolina to fight in Bentonville. I'm at a location called the Bullpen, and this was an extremely hard fought over location here, where battle flags traded hands back and forth all the time. But the tree line over there is where the Union soldiers were, and it was a tough position for them to fortify because of the swampy conditions that were out there in those tree lines. Now, I'll put the battle map up on the screen here so you can see what we're looking at. Now, if you look at the silver dot, I'm facing in the direction that Colquitt and Clingman are actually going towards. And all off in the direction in front of me is the 98th, 108th, and 113th Ohio, right directly ahead. And then filling in the gap there, you can see where the Confederate soldiers had actually pushed their way through, coming from this road over here. I'll put the map up again for you to take a look. From the position that I'm in right now, I'm actually behind Ohio's position, facing towards the Confederates coming across the field in front of me. And then, and you can see that by looking at the black dot that's in the center of the map that I'm about to put, that I put up there for you. And that's actually facing in the direction of the Confederates in the middle of the melee. Now, looking at the position on that map, now look at the screen here as I'm panning out towards the fields. That's all happening right here in the middle. You have Confederates stuck in the middle. You got Union soldiers across the field, and Confederates have been pushing them back. You have Confederates over here. You've got Union back here, and you have Union soldiers all throughout the fields back here. It's a pretty amazing and chaotic place here. Now, directly off in front of me here, and to the left-hand position, which is roughly over in this area here, Confederate Major General Robert F. Hoke's division, on loan from the Army of Northern Virginia, blocked the Goldsboro Road to deflect the oncoming Union advance. The division was a mixed bag of veterans from places like Gettysburg and Cold Harbor. They were considered what they call Red Infantry, artillery units from Fort Fisher and other coastal forts. And teenage boys, basically, and they were formed into 3 regiments as a last-ditch effort to stop the fight here. Out here on these fields, you can still see the history left behind. And though these fields no longer have the plantations or the homes or anything, or even any of the family members left behind, they still have plots like this. This is the Cole family cemetery. And this is where a lot of the ancestors of that family were buried out here at the fields where the Battle of Bentonville took place. Some of the people buried in this plot here were witness to that history. So March 19th out here in this position, this field would have been lit up left and right. Confederates are firing from behind me here. They're coming in my direction where the Union soldiers are. They're fighting left and right all over this place. This is a deadly place to be if you're out here, March 19th, 1865. This battle is probably just as bad as any other battle that happened in Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, or anywhere else. And we're still talking about 1865 here, right before the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in April. the Civil War is very much alive during that month here in North Carolina. Now, when I'm on these fields and I get the chance to highlight something pretty amazing, other than just the battle itself, I do it. And out here in this position, there's a marker right behind me for Private Peter Anderson. Now, Private Peter Anderson is just like any other soldier in the United States Army, except for here in this location, Private Anderson ends up wheeling a artillery piece similar to the one that's behind me here, all by himself, off the field, in the face of the enemy, saving that piece of artillery from getting into the clutches of the Confederate soldiers. And for his heroism and bravery out here on this field, he received the Medal of Honor. So Anderson's bravery wasn't taken lightly either. General Sherman himself appreciated the young man's bravery in the face of the enemy. And when he got out here to this position, realizing what happened after the battle, he personally congratulated Private Anderson on a job well done, shook his hand, and then gave him a captain's commission right there on the spot. And eventually, because of his heroism, he gets that Medal of Honor like we just said earlier. It's a pretty amazing thing for this man. So Private Anderson wasn't the only Medal of Honor recipient out here in this exact field. First Lieutenant Dougal was out here as well. Now, First Lieutenant Dougal ended up coming back across these fields, even though the enemy was out here heavily guarding these fields and firing across them. But he noticed that his color bearer had actually fallen. And he ran across these fields and he picked up the colors and saved the flag from capture, which was a pretty big deal in those days. Your flag represented the position of your troops. And it also represented the pride of your unit. For him to come across this field and risk his life for a flag was pretty major. So for his heroism, grabbing that flag and picking it up off the field and coming back across this field with the enemy all around him, he received a Medal of Honor. Forgive me if I can't get the sound just right here on this video. There's a lot of wind out here today. But a little battlefield orientation. So off in this direction over here, we have the Confederates coming from that direction. And I'll put the map up on the screen so you can see real quick who's coming over here. We have Taliaferro from Hardy. Loring's men's coming up, Hill, Bate, all off in that direction, headed right towards where I'm at right now. Angled off and pointing in this direction here, this is the position where all the artillery is. Now if you take a look at that map, you'll see a little silver dot on it, and it's got an arrow that's pointing out. This is the direction that the arrow points to. That's where the Union artillery is. That you can see the 143rd New York, Robinson's, Fearing, Jackson, Ward, and Dustin off in that direction. You look at that part of the map. They are wrapping back around in this direction over here. So the Union soldiers are facing us in this direction and preparing for battle, essentially. And going back across in this direction over here, right behind where that vehicle is, that's where another set of Union soldiers are, with New York, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. And if you look on that map, I'll put it back up again, and you see Morgan and Mitchell. They're off back in this tree line over here, and the Confederates are facing them from the opposing tree line heading in this direction. And one last quick note, this is the Morris Farm. On the morning of March 19th, 1865, this is where a majority of the guns were massed that played a significant role in blunting the final Confederate attacks on the first day of Bentonville. 4 batteries, 4 guns each, were arrayed on both sides of the ravine north of the Goldsboro Road. These 16 guns held commanding angle of the field. So, when we're talking about the road, it's right over here. 16 guns on either side, facing in the directions of the Confederates who are heading over here. And directly in front of me here is the farm field where the Confederates would have come across on March 19th, 1865. The Union Army was out here at this location after basically having Carlin's division at the coal plantation essentially be crushed and moved back to this position. The Confederates were actually winning the battle at this point, and they were pushing the Union Army back on its heels. It was so bad that the wounded men that were inside the hospital out here, which was basically the Morris House, ended up having to be moved a half a mile in that direction over there to where the Harper's house was. This was probably as good as it was going to get out here for the Confederate Army. Now I'll put that map back up on the screen that we had earlier so that you can see the position again. Now, ignore that little silver ball that's in the middle there that points to where we're at, because we're not in that location. We're across the field in a different direction. But if you look at the Confederate Army and its men in the red angle there, look for the name of Rhett, Clayton, and Harrison. Harrison is directly in front of us, about 3 rows back. And you can see Clayton in front of him, Keenan and Smith, Finley, Tyler, Smith, and Govan. They're all headed in this direction here towards us, all across these fields here. Now across the road there, angled in this direction, headed that way, is where you have Kennedy and Walthall towards the 20th Connecticut, New York, Ohio, and all of those guys are angled in this direction and looping back around that way. And again, I'll put the map back up here on the screen. Take a look, follow that road that is directly beside where that little silver ball is in the center of the map there. That road runs all the way down towards Loring, and you can see off the right-hand side Mitchell, Morgan, and Cogswell. That is the Union Army's position over on this side of the field here. So I'm no expert on ordnance when it comes to the Civil War, but I am an expert on reading signs. And there's a sign out here that talks about this piece of ordnance that's on the field. Now this is a reproduction of a 3-inch ordnance rifle. And according to the sign, which is probably put in place by some historians, this particular piece of ordnance was created in the 1850s and was the first of its kind to use rifling inside of the barrel of the cannon. And during the American Civil War, more than 1,000 of these pieces were ordered up by the United States Army and were used to blunt attacks all across battlefields in the American Civil War. Essentially, the reason why this thing is so deadly is the small piece that gets put inside. It's not a very large piece of ordnance. It goes inside that barrel there behind me, and it has grooves on it. And the barrel itself also has grooves on the inside. And as it comes out, with all of that explosiveness behind it, it is spiraled like a football, making it more accurate and a lot more deadly for the forces that are in front of this rifle. So directly across this dirt road here in front of me was once the location of Willis Cole's plantation home. March 19th of 1865, Lieutenant Colonel Cyrus Bryant's wing of Brigadier General Harrison Hobart's Corps commanded this area until heavy Confederate fire forced them into a ravine that ran through the woods right to the front and left of where we're at right now. So if you look off in the direction over here, it kind of dips down. This is the front and left area. This is where the ravine was, where they ended up having to fall back into position. Hobart's brigade, the entire Union line, and Michael Fitch, with the other wing, remained several hundred yards to the south below the Goldsboro Road. Chosen to fill this position was Brigadier General James Robinson's Corps. Through Robinson's entire brigade, they would have to struggle to plug the gap. He was ordered to leave half his brigade to bolster defenses at the Morris Farm, where we were just at. And reduced to 3 regiments just before 3, Robinson deployed behind us here in support of the isolated 19th Indiana Battery. Suddenly, the Army of Tennessee struck, sending most of the Corps troops north of the Goldsboro Road, fleeing in disorder. Now you can imagine, that army comes out and just starts smashing into them, and now we got them fleeing off across this field here. And if you look at the gap that goes right between those trees there, you can just make out the location where we were just at over at the Morris Farm. That's the general direction where those soldiers are now fleeing. They're going down past those hills and out in the fields across the Moore's farm towards where the Union batteries are being set up. So I don't know if you can see this in the background or not, but lying low here is a small depression in the ground, and then it rises up steadily over here, and there is a bridge behind me that goes up and over the earthworks that are out here. They were dug by Michigan. I'm climbing up over them right now, so maybe we can get a better view of it for you. That's them right there. So this was the extended line of the Union Army out here for William Sherman. And out in this location, they knew that they had to put in more fortifications out here to extend the line out to continue the war effort back here towards the Harper's House. Now, Harper's House is off in the distance, right over in that direction. That became a field hospital, like I said in the earlier videos about it. And that location was also key. So if you have your earthworks here in place to protect your soldiers behind it, and you have to have a fallback point, or you have soldiers that are trapped inside of a hospital, for example, these fortifications become very necessary, very important. So out here at this location, we had some pretty important soldiers out here. They carried weapons on them, but they weren't necessarily soldiers for the fight, although they did fight. They were engineers. They were with the 1st Michigan Engineers. And I'm going to walk over to a depression that's in the ground right now. It's not very big, but it is the remnants of the earthworks and fortifications that they put out here for the Battle of Bentonville. They were known for repairing roads, destroying roads, and railroads, most importantly. And in Sherman's army, they did a whole lot of destroying railroads and roads. And that's mostly what they were known for. But out here, March 19th, 1865, they started digging these trenches and putting in the fortifications for what would be a major and decisive victory for the Union Army. Now I'm out here at a location called the Harper House in Bentonville, North Carolina. John Harper was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he left this homestead here to his wife. They'd actually traveled down from a location near or around Harper's Ferry, today modern West Virginia. When they got here, they had a farm in place, and they had basic everyday life from North Carolina out here, and they probably never expected that a major attack or a major fight was going to happen out here, but their family figured it out soon enough. John Harper and his wife were no longer in the picture at the time that the battle took place here, and his family were left the estate and left the house. This house behind me here directly became a hospital for Union and Confederate soldiers, primarily Union soldiers. I think one of the signs out here mentioned something like 500 Union soldiers were treated in this location. There were about 40 or 50 Confederates that were treated out here. And just directly across the street from where I'm at right now was a cemetery put in place for about 20 to 23 Confederate soldiers that died inside this house here from the Battle of Bentonville. This battle would result in just next to nothing, really. Sherman comes up here, and a combined force of roughly 60,000 soldiers are out here against the small force of Confederate soldiers, and you end up with a major battle that takes place out here and 4,200 casualties as a result. It's really all for nothing, because the Confederacy was in its waning days, the very end of the end. Eventually, Robert E. Lee and his forces are surrendered. Eventually, the forces out here are surrendered. The end's pretty much near. You're talking about Fort Fisher falling in January, Wilmington's falling shortly after that, Bentonville here. It's pretty clear that the noose is being tightened around those Confederate forces and what's left of its government. And by the time this place is done and Robert E. Lee is pushed out and on the run, the entire government in Richmond is literally on the run. And it all becomes a footnote in history. It's been a great time taking you guys out here to Bentonville, North Carolina. Unfortunately, the park itself was closed, so I couldn't get into the visitor center or get any materials for the video out here. But fortunate enough for me, they had some maps up of the driving tour that I could take, and that's pretty much what I used to create this video for you guys, to see a little bit of what you can see out here at Bentonville, North Carolina. You know, this statue that's behind me here was dedicated long after the battle had ended. And Wade Hampton came out here to dedicate this statue. And he said something that I'm sure had a different meaning for him, but still sort of resonates. He said, "Time may teach us to forgive, but it will never teach us to forget." History is that tool that we use so that we don't forget. So when you go to these places, no matter what your thought process is, just understand these places they're very important spots in history, and they're here for a reason. They're here to teach us a lesson about the way things were in this country, about life before us. And they're also here to teach us about the sacrifices of the soldiers that fought to preserve the country that we live in today. If it weren't for those soldiers fighting in the forces directly behind me there, and the United States soldiers coming across these fields in the Union to try to preserve the Union, there would be no United States today. I hope you had fun watching this video and you take something back with you. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.